Snow fell like sifted flour over the roofs of Willowbend, a lonely town that had long forgotten spring. The sky was the color of pewter, heavy with silence, and the only sound came from boots breaking the crust of new snow and the faint jingle of a horse's bit down the frozen lane. Nora Callahan walked that road alone, her shawl drawn close, a basket of bread swinging from her gloved hand. Her breath came in white ghosts. The wind carried whispers behind her, soft, slicing things that traveled faster than mercy. She's 50, poor thing. Still wears her hair like she's 20. Can't let go of dreams that died. Nora didn't flinch. The words had become weather, constant, biting, but survivable. She kept walking, eyes on the snow, until the sound of laughter reached her from the general store. Through the frosted glass, she saw a young couple by the stove, his arm around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder. They looked like warmth itself. Nora lingered one moment too long, and the young woman's gaze met hers. Pity, quick as a knife, passed across the girl's face before she looked away. Nora turned and kept walking. By the time she reached her cabin at the edge of town, her hands were numb, and the last streak of daylight had drained from the world. The cabin was small, crouched against a stand of pines, its windows glowing faintly like tired eyes. Inside, she lit the lamp, took off her gloves, and rubbed her stiff fingers together. The silence pressed around her like another wall. She set the bread on the table, some for tomorrow, some for the chickens if they survived the cold, and poured herself tea gone tepid long before it touched her lips. The mirror above the hearth had cracked years ago, splitting her reflection in two. One side looked like the woman she'd been. Hair dark, cheeks bright, eyes still believing. The other was the truth. Silver strands, lines deepened by winters, a mouth used more for endurance than laughter. "I'm too old for marriage," she whispered to the ghost of herself. The sound of it broke something soft inside her. She sank into the chair by the fire and stared into the flames until the wood began to whisper and crackle, the sound almost like breathing. Outside, the storm thickened. Wind moved through the pines in long sighs. Somewhere beyond the fence, a branch broke under the weight of snow, followed by a heavy thud. Nora looked up, her heart quickening. The sound came again, a low groan, not the voice of wind. She rose, took the lantern from its hook, and stepped outside. The cold hit her face like a slap. Snow swirled around her in pale ribbons. She followed the sound, boots crunching through the drifts, until the lantern light fell on a dark shape near the fence. A man, crumpled in the snow. His hair was black as crow feathers, his skin copper dark, his bare shoulders streaked with blood that steamed faintly in the cold. "Dear God!" she breathed, kneeling beside him. His lips moved, the words lost to the storm. She could see the shallow rise of his chest, the jagged wound along his ribs. He wasn't white. He wasn't from town. An Apache, she realized. One of the men the soldiers had been hunting last summer after a raid gone wrong. She looked back toward the faint lights of town, then down at the man again. He was dying. She hesitated only a moment before sliding her arms beneath him. He was heavy, taller than any man she'd known, his skin fever-hot against her cold sleeves. She dragged him toward the cabin, her muscles trembling, her breath ragged. By the time she pushed the door shut behind them, she was shaking from exhaustion. She laid him near the hearth, cutting his shirt away with trembling hands. The wound was deep but not fatal if tended. She heated water, tore one of her old dresses into strips, and cleaned him as best she could. His body bore other scars too, old burns, knife marks, as if the world had already taken its share from him. When she touched the edge of his wound, his eyes opened suddenly, startling her. They were dark, unyielding, but not cruel. "Don't move," she said softly, as if speaking to a wild creature. He didn't understand, but the tone stilled him. His gaze moved over the cabin, the lamp, the fire, her face, and then back to her eyes. Something passed between them, silent but human. She worked until the bleeding slowed, then wrapped him in a quilt and set the kettle on again. Hours passed. The wind howled. She dozed by the fire, lantern flickering. Once, she woke to find him watching her, his expression unreadable. He pointed toward her, then to the hearth, murmuring a word she didn't know. She shook her head. He tried again, slower, his hand over his heart. "Kindness," he said, voice rough as gravel. Then he closed his eyes. Nora stared at him for a long time. She hadn't heard a man say a kind word to her in years. She reached out, almost against her will, and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. It was damp with sweat. Outside, the wind eased, as if holding its breath. She rose to check the latch on the door and froze. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of hooves. More than one horse. The muffled clatter carried through the snow like a heartbeat. She went to the window. Lanterns moved in the dark. 3, maybe 4. Men shouting faintly against the wind. Her pulse leapt. They were searching for someone. For him. She turned to the man sleeping on her floor. His breath came slow, steady now. A fugitive, maybe. A murderer, if the town was to be believed. But she looked at the ragged wound, at the way his hand twitched even in sleep as if he'd fought too long to rest, and something in her refused the easy fear. She blew out the lamp, the room sinking into shadow, and whispered to the darkness, "Hush now." She gathered the blankets around him, and dragged another log onto the fire to drown the noise of the horses. The flames caught slowly, painting her face in gold and shadow. The hooves grew louder. A man's voice called, "Nora. You out here?" It was Sheriff Briggs. She didn't move. The fire crackled. Snow hissed against the windows. After a long moment, the sound of hooves turned away, fading back toward town. Only then did she breathe again. She sat beside the stranger, her hands still trembling. She thought of the whispers in town, of how quickly mercy turned to judgment, and how a single act of compassion could brand her foolish, or worse. The firelight softened his face. He looked younger in sleep, though the lines around his eyes told of years that hadn't been kind. She pulled the quilt higher over his chest. "Rest," she murmured. "The world can wait till morning." The storm quieted. Snow gathered against the door, sealing them in together. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion sinking deep into her bones, but beneath it, a strange calm. The kind that comes when you've already made the choice that changes everything. Her eyes closed for a moment, then opened again when a shadow moved across the frosted window. Lantern light flickered outside. Someone still searching, circling the edge of her land. Nora's heart stilled. She reached for the poker by the fire, gripping it tight. The man stirred and opened his eyes, dark and sharp again. He followed her gaze toward the window, then met her eyes. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. The world outside howled, but inside the cabin, time seemed to stop. Two strangers, bound by danger, watching the same ghostly light move across the snow. The lantern outside paused, then slowly turned back toward town, fading into the storm. Nora lowered the poker, her breath shaking out in relief. In the silence that followed, he spoke again, barely a whisper. "Safe?" She nodded. "For now." He watched her for another moment, then whispered something in his language, low, rhythmic, almost like a prayer, and closed his eyes. Nora sat still, the poker still warm in her hand. The words she didn't understand lingered in the air like smoke. She looked toward the cracked mirror above the hearth. In it, her reflection wavered beside his. For the first time in years, she didn't look alone. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless. Inside, the firelight trembled, holding its fragile peace, until, faint and distant, the sound of a rifle cocking echoed through the storm. Morning came softly, as if afraid to wake them. The storm had passed, leaving the land blank and shining beneath a pale sun. Nora opened her eyes to the crackle of fire, and the steady rhythm of breath beside it. The man still lay near the hearth, wrapped in her quilt, his chest rising slow and deep. For a long moment she simply watched the light play across his face, the curve of his cheekbone, the scar at his temple, the strength in his jaw softened by sleep. There was peace there, something she hadn't seen on a man's face in years. When he stirred, she moved quietly to the stove, setting water to boil. The sound of metal against wood made him open his eyes. He rose halfway, wincing, one hand over his ribs. "No," she said gently, lifting a hand. "Stay still." He didn't understand the words, but the tone made him sink back down. Nora poured him a cup of broth, kneeling beside him. The steam curled between them, carrying the smell of salt and onion. He sat up slowly, eyes on her face, then took the cup in both hands. His fingers brushed hers, rough, warm. He drank, and she watched the color return to his cheeks. When she stood, he murmured something she didn't catch. She frowned. What? He tried again, slower. You safe? She hesitated, surprised. I should be asking you that. His lips curved, just faintly. They didn't speak again that morning. The cabin filled with the sounds of living. The crack of kindling, the creak of the chair as she mended his torn shirt, the faint hum of wind against the eaves. When she went outside to fetch wood, the air burned her lungs, but it was bright and clean, and the world smelled of pine and smoke. She could see tracks where the sheriff's men had ridden off, their prints now glazed with ice. When she returned, Tasso, she would learn that name later, from the mark he carved on the doorframe, was sitting upright by the fire, sharpening a small blade he'd taken from his boot. He looked up as she entered, not in threat but acknowledgement. She saw the faintest nod. Hungry? She asked. He tilted his head, unsure, then she pointed to the pot. Eat. He understood that. They shared the meal in silence. The rhythm of their breaths filled the gaps that language could not. Afterward, he pointed to her broom, then to the hearth. She nodded, and he swept the ashes out, slow and careful. The simple act made something twist inside her. A kindness without obligation, a man doing not what he owed but what he chose. Later, when she went to bring in water from the well, he followed, limping but steady. She tried to stop him, but he shook his head, taking the bucket from her hands. Strong, he said, tapping his chest. Then he added softly, You small no. Her lips parted, a retort ready, but he wasn't mocking. His eyes held that same steady respect, and before she could answer, he'd carried the full bucket inside. Days folded into one another, each one quieter than the last. Snow sealed the world, muting every sound. Inside the cabin, they moved like two souls caught between seasons, separate, yet bound by necessity. She cooked, he worked. He repaired her fence with pieces of scrap wood, split logs for the fire, fetched water without being asked. When she heard her hand on the axe handle, he reached out, cradling her fingers with a gentleness that stunned her. The nights were harder. The wind would rise, moaning through the trees, and she'd wake to find him sitting near the window, eyes watchful. Once, she asked softly, You can't sleep? He only looked at her, then said, Dreams bad. His voice cracked on the word. She didn't ask more. One evening, she took down her sewing and sat beside him. The fire painted their faces in orange light. He traced something into the ash with a stick, a circle, 2 lines crossing it, then another mark beneath. She pointed. What's that? He thought, searching for the word. Family, he said finally. Then, touching his chest, he added, Gone. She looked down, the thread trembling between her fingers. Mine too, she said. It was the first time she had spoken those words aloud in years. He studied her face, understanding more than language could carry. After a long moment he rose, took a piece of wood from the pile, and began to carve. She watched, the knife glinting in the firelight, chips falling like snowflakes. When he finished, he placed it on the table, a small figure of a woman holding a lantern. She stared at it, unable to speak. Her throat tightened. Why? She whispered. He pointed to the carved light in her hands. You, he said simply. Something inside her shifted then, something long frozen cracking open. She reached out, brushing her fingertips over the carving, then over his hand. He didn't pull away. The next day, the spell of quiet broke. Hoof prints appeared again near the fence, fresh ones. Someone had come while they slept. Nora found the tracks at dawn, her breath misting in the cold. She stood there a long time, heart thudding, before turning back toward the house. Inside, Tasso was awake, already tending the fire. He saw her face and went still. Men, she said, pointing toward the yard. He nodded once, calm as the snow outside. They can't find you here, she said. Not again. He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, If they come, I go. No, The word came from her without thought. You'd freeze out there. He studied her eyes, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't agreement, it was understanding. That night, the storm returned. The wind screamed across the plains, rattling the shutters. She sat by the fire, pretending to read an old Bible, but her eyes never moved across the page. Tasso sat across from her, carving again, the rhythmic scrape of his knife against wood somehow steadying. When a gust slammed the door, she jumped. His eyes flicked up, meeting hers, and for the first time, she saw something soft in them, concern. He set the knife down and reached across the space between them. His fingers brushed hers, warm, solid. She didn't pull away this time. The touch was small, almost nothing, yet it filled the room. The fire dimmed, and they sat in the half-dark, the sound of the storm rising and falling like breath. At last she whispered, "You shouldn't have stayed." He answered after a long pause, "Storm stay. I stay." She almost smiled. "You're stubborn." He tilted his head, trying to understand, then repeated carefully, "Stubborn?" She nodded. "Yes. Like me." He grinned then, a quiet, rare thing, and the cabin felt warmer for it. Hours later, when she drifted toward sleep, she thought she heard footsteps outside again. She rose, peering through the frosted glass, but saw only swirling snow. Still, something in the air had changed, a sense of being watched. She turned back to him. Tasso's eyes were open, already fixed on the window. He had heard it too. Neither spoke. The fire cracked, and the wind carried a distant echo, the sharp whinny of a horse. Nora's heart clenched. She blew out the lamp, darkness folding around them like a cloak. Outside, unseen, a lantern moved once between the trees, then vanished into the snow. By the end of the week, the snow began to melt, and with it came whispers that traveled faster than thawing creeks. They started at the general store, 2 women by the flour sacks, then moved to the church porch, the saloon, the blacksmith's bench. Old Nora Callahan's keeping company with a savage. The words spread like smoke on wind, impossible to catch or silence. Nora felt them long before she heard them. The air itself changed when she walked into town. People who once nodded politely now looked away. The butcher's wife pretended not to see her. The preacher's boy whispered something that made his friends snicker. Even the dogs seemed to bark more when she passed. She kept her chin high, her shawl tight, pretending she didn't notice, but the shame crawled under her skin like frost. When she returned to her cabin that afternoon, Tasso was mending the gate. He looked up when he saw her, reading the tension in her face the way one reads weather. "Bad?" he asked. She tried to smile, but it came out brittle. "People talk, that's all." He frowned, puzzled. "Talk?" "Gossip," she said, gesturing vaguely toward town. "They think we—" She stopped, unable to finish. Heat crept into her cheeks. He waited, still and quiet. When she didn't go on, he only said, "Let them." The simplicity of it struck her like a chord. No shame, no anger, only the certainty of someone who'd already lived beyond judgment. She envied it, even as it frightened her. Later that evening, she saw Sheriff Briggs ride up the road, his horse's hooves breaking the crust of ice. Her stomach dropped. She wiped her hands on her apron, trying to steady herself. Tasso stood at the door before she could speak, his jaw tight. Briggs dismounted, his breath misting in the cold. "Afternoon, Nora." "Sheriff." His gaze shifted past her shoulder, catching the shadow of Tasso inside. "You've got company." She stepped into the doorway, blocking the view. "I've got someone who needed help." "Help?" He barked a short laugh. "That what we're calling it now?" Her face burned. He was bleeding in the snow. "Would you have left him there?" The sheriff's smile was thin. "You know what the papers say, don't you? Apache raid up north, 3 dead settlers. You sure you took in the right man?" "He hasn't hurt anyone." "Not yet." His tone softened, but his eyes stayed hard. "I'm doing you a kindness, Nora. Folks already talk. Best thing you can do is send him on his way before they decide you're part of whatever trouble he's bringing." She wanted to answer, but words failed her. He tipped his hat and turned toward his horse. "Snow's melting," he said over his shoulder. Means roads'll open soon. So should your door. When he was gone, Nora closed the door and leaned against it, trembling. Tasso stood a few steps away watching. He didn't need to understand the words. Her face said enough. "He want me gone," he said quietly. She looked up at him, something fierce rising through the fear. "I won't let them take you." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, slow and solemn. "Then we stay." That night, she dreamed of fire, of torches moving through the dark, of voices shouting her name. When she woke, the room was still, the fire low. Tasso sat by the window, watching the horizon. His presence steadied her, though the dream clung like cobwebs. Over the next days, the thaw quickened. Streams began to murmur again, roofs dripped, and the roads filled with mud. But the thaw brought more riders too. Men with rifles slung carelessly across their backs, faces hidden under hats. They passed by her fence without slowing, but she saw the glint of curiosity in their eyes. One afternoon, she went into town to trade for flour. Conversation stopped when she entered the store. Mary Lou, the inn girl, offered a weak smile, but the others turned their backs. Nora gathered what she needed and set the coins on the counter. Mr. Haynes, the shopkeeper, didn't meet her eyes. "You best be careful, Miss Callahan," he muttered. "Some men think they're doing God's work when they come after his kind." Nora froze. "His kind?" "You heard me." He counted her change, his fingers trembling just enough to betray fear. Outside, the air stung with sleet. She walked home fast, her boots sinking into half-melted snow, her pulse thudding with something she couldn't name, anger, maybe, or sorrow. By the time she reached her cabin, dusk had swallowed the valley. Tasso was chopping wood near the barn. He looked up when she approached, reading her mood instantly. She told him in broken words what she'd heard. He listened without interruption, then leaned on the axe, eyes dark as storm water. "People fear," he said. "Fear makes hate." She nodded, throat tight. "They don't understand." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his breath. "You understand." The words were quiet, but they struck deeper than any accusation. She turned away, flustered, heart pounding in a way she hadn't felt since she was a girl. "It doesn't matter what I understand," she murmured. "They'll come." He looked toward the horizon, where the last strip of light was dying. "Then we wait." That night the wind returned, carrying voices, faint, drunken laughter from somewhere down the road. Nora stood by the window, hands clasped. She could see distant lanterns bobbing like fireflies between the trees. Tasso stood beside her, silent, the muscles in his arms tense. When one lantern broke away from the others and began moving toward the cabin, Nora felt her breath catch. The light swayed closer, a silhouette behind it. Then another. Then three. She backed away from the window. "They're coming," she whispered. Tasso reached for his knife, stilling her with a look. "Stay." He moved to the door, every motion deliberate, his bare shoulders gleaming in the dim firelight. She wanted to stop him, to hold him there, but her voice wouldn't come. The footsteps outside crunched nearer, then halted. "Callahan." A voice barked, "Briggs. We know he's in there." Tasso looked back at her, eyes calm, unafraid. "I go," he said. "No blood." She stepped forward, grabbing his arm. "If they take you, they'll kill you." He held her gaze. "Better me than you." Her throat burned. "Don't you dare." He hesitated then, the strength in her voice cutting through the calm. Outside, the sheriff called again. The sound of rifles being cocked followed. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She moved in front of him, planting herself between the door and his body. "They'll have to shoot through me first." His jaw tightened. For a moment, they stared at each other, two lives drawn together by the smallest mercy. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of her shawl. "You brave," he said softly. "Too brave." A heavy fist pounded the door. "Open up, Nora. Don't make this worse." The fire hissed as if warning them both. She took a breath, lifted her chin and whispered, "Let them try." The latch quivered under the next blow. The boards groaned. Tasso moved behind her, close enough that she could feel his heat at her back. Outside, a torch flared, its light seeping through the cracks of the window like liquid fire. And as the door began to splinter, Nora whispered into the dark, "Then we stand together." The door gave way with a crack that split the night. Snow and torchlight rushed in together, flames painting the floorboards in restless gold. Sheriff Briggs stood framed in the doorway, his face hard, steam rising from his breath. Behind him, two men held rifles, their eyes sharp with the kind of righteousness born of fear. "Step aside, Nora," the sheriff said, his voice steady but cold. "You don't know what you're protecting." She didn't move. The draft whipped her hair across her face, but her chin stayed high. "I know exactly what I'm protecting," she said. Her voice shook, but not from fear. "A man who bled in the snow and never raised his hand to harm me." Briggs' gaze darted to the figure behind her. Tasso stepped forward into the light, tall and silent, the fire catching the scars on his skin. The sight made one of the younger men falter, lowering his rifle slightly. The sheriff's hand twitched toward his holster. "You'll move, or I'll make you." Tasso said nothing. His presence filled the room like a shadow with weight. Nora could feel his calm behind her, could hear the slow rhythm of his breathing against the chaos of the wind outside. "You'll kill an innocent man for the comfort of a lie," she said. "That's not law, Sheriff. That's cowardice." Briggs' face hardened. "You call this savage innocent? He led raids that burned half the valley." He was hunted," she interrupted. "And still he showed mercy." Her hand trembled, but she held his gaze. "Can you say the same?" The sheriff's eyes flickered, a glint of uncertainty breaking through the iron. "Step aside, Nora. Last warning." Tasso moved then, one quiet step forward, no weapon in hand. His voice was low, measured. "No fight. No blood." The younger deputy shifted, uncertain. "Maybe he's tellin' the truth, Harlan." "Quiet," Briggs snapped, but his tone wavered. He drew his gun. Nora gasped, stepping between them, arms spread. The barrel gleamed inches from her chest. "Don't," she whispered. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then the fire cracked, a log splitting in two, and the sound startled Briggs. His finger jerked. The shot rang out. Nora felt the heat of it graze past her shoulder. She stumbled back, pain flaring, though the bullet had only nicked her shawl. Tasso lunged forward, faster than thought. The sheriff's arm was wrenched aside, the gun clattering to the floor. One of the men raised his rifle. Tasso swung, striking it away. The butt hit the man's jaw, sending him sprawling. Another grabbed a torch, thrusting it toward them. Flames caught the edge of the curtain, and within seconds, fire licked up the wall. "Nora!" Tasso shouted. She grabbed the water bucket, flinging it across the fire, but it hissed uselessly, feeding the steam. The sheriff scrambled to his feet, shouting for his men to retreat. Smoke filled the cabin, thick and choking. Tasso turned to her, his eyes fierce. "Go! I won't leave you." He seized her hand, dragging her toward the door. Together. Outside, the snow roared white and endless. The cold hit like knives, but the flames behind them burned brighter, hungry and alive. The sheriff staggered out after them, coughing, his hat gone, his pride burned raw. "You'll hang for this," he rasped. Nora stood trembling, the fire reflecting in her eyes. "No," she said softly. "You will answer for it." From down the hill came the echo of hooves. More men, more torches. But another sound joined it. The chime of a bell, clear and sharp through the wind. The preacher's wagon crested the rise, lantern swinging. Reverend Pike leapt down, his white hair wild. "Hold your fire!" he shouted. "Hold it, by God!" Briggs froze, lowering his half-raised pistol. Pike strode forward, clutching a damp newspaper. "You fool!" he said to the sheriff, his voice trembling with fury. "This man's no raider. The army cleared his band last week. They were the ones attacked, not the attackers. You're about to murder a man already absolved." Silence fell, heavy and unreal. The snow hissed as the cabin behind them collapsed inward, sparks scattering into the dark. Briggs looked from the preacher to Nora, then to Tasso, who stood unmoving, his chest rising slow, eyes cold as stone. The sheriff's shoulders sagged. "God forgive me," he whispered and turned away. His men followed, their torches snuffed one by one, until the valley was swallowed again by night. When the last hoofbeats faded, Nora turned to Tasso. The firelight behind them painted the snow in shades of gold and red. She touched his arm. "You're free now." He looked at her, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. "Free," he repeated quietly, as if testing the word. Then he looked toward the horizon, where the wind swept over miles of unbroken white. The preacher approached, his face softened with pity. "You should both leave before dawn," he said. "The town won't forgive what it saw tonight, no matter who was right." Nora nodded, her voice steady. "We will." Pike's eyes lingered on her, as if seeing for the first time the depth of her resolve. "You've done a brave thing," he said. "But the brave are seldom thanked." Then he turned and left, the sound of his boots fading into the storm. Nora and Tasso stood alone. The cabin that had sheltered them was gone, only embers now, glowing faintly like dying stars. The snow began to fall again, gentler this time, as if the world itself wished to cover the scars. She shivered, wrapping her shawl tighter. He stepped closer, pulling his own blanket around her shoulders. The gesture was wordless, but it said more than language could bear. She looked up at him. This man who had come into her life like winter, fierce and silent, and melted something she thought had died long ago. "What will you do now?" she asked softly. He met her gaze. "Go home." "Far?" She nodded. "And me?" He hesitated, then reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You come if you want." Her eyes filled, not with tears but with something steadier, acceptance, maybe even peace. "They'll talk," she said. He smiled faintly. "Let them." For a long moment they stood facing each other, the snow gathering on their shoulders, the fire dying behind them. The air smelled of smoke and pine, of endings and beginnings tangled together. She reached for his hand and he took it, his grip firm, warm against the cold. As they began walking away from the ruins, dawn broke, soft pink light spilling across the white horizon. Their footprints marked the snow in parallel lines, vanishing slowly behind them. Halfway down the hill, Nora stopped. The valley spread below like a promise, silent and untouched. She turned to look back one last time. The cabin's ashes smoked faintly in the wind, a thin column rising to meet the sky. It looked almost like a prayer. Tasso came beside her, his voice a low murmur. "You were never old," he said. Her breath caught. She looked at him, at the snowflakes caught in his dark hair, at the quiet certainty in his eyes. "No," she whispered. "Just waiting." He nodded, and for the first time, she saw him smile. Not the guarded half-smile of gratitude, but something open, human, and bright. He leaned down, pressing his forehead gently against hers. "You're mine now," he whispered. The words didn't claim, they freed. She closed her eyes, breathing in the cold, clean air. For the first time in years, she felt young, not in body but in soul, lit from within like a hearth newly tended. Behind them, the fire flickered one last time before the snow buried it completely. Ahead, the world waited, wide, white, unbroken. And as they disappeared into it, hand in hand, the wind carried their footprints away, leaving only the soft trace of warmth where love had once stood against the storm.